A fisherman was casting his nets into the sea on another ordinary morning when a peculiar sound coming from a set of rocks caught his attention. Cautiously, he approached to investigate, and what he found left him completely speechless. Something miraculous revealed itself before his eyes, transforming that routine day into an extraordinary event. John, as he was called, lived in tune with the rhythm of the tides. His days began at dawn, before the sun even rose on the horizon, when the sky was still a gray shadow and the salty smell of the ocean filled the air. The mornings were always quiet, almost sacred in their serenity, and in that moment of solitude, as he prepared the boat for another journey at sea, John found a strange peace, even if burdened by the shadow of his losses. Rivertown, the town where he grew up, was his home. Small and peaceful, the town nestled on the seashore, far from the hustle and bustle of the big cities. There, time seemed to follow the rhythm of the waves, with the weather and the sea dictating the pace of life. The town was marked by its small wooden houses along the harbor, with roofs worn down by the wind and salt water, a reflection of the hard life by the sea. Fishing, impregnated with salt and wind, was the essence of Rivertown, and John had always known that this was his destiny. Since he was young, he helped his father, a robust fisherman of few words but with calloused and strong hands. Alongside him, John learned his trade on the waves, pulling nets, feeling the weight of the sea. For the family, the sea was more than a livelihood, it was a refuge, a place to escape from the pains of life. As a child, John would look to the horizon with eyes full of dreams of distant adventures. However, as he grew older, these dreams began to fade, replaced by the reality of the stable life in Rivertown. His mother, a strong woman, did not go to sea, but her presence was just as essential. She transformed the family home into a gathering place for sailors and neighbors, providing simple but warm meals. The aroma of freshly baked bread and homemade stews filled the small house, making it a welcoming place. Those were days when John's world felt complete, filled with warmth, love, and laughter, a time when his home was always alive and full of life. Now, faced with this unexpected miracle, John felt the past and present intertwine, bringing to the surface deep emotions that he thought had been buried over time. Over the years, his parents' conversations had been short and to the point, with little room for affection or long conversations. Over time, however, John had taken on more and more responsibilities within the family, especially as his father's health began to decline. The sea, which had sustained the family for decades, had also taken its toll on the man's aging body, and it was clear that he could not continue for much longer. John now found himself in the role of head of the family, fishing during the day and managing the family business at night. There was never any complaint from him, after all, it was the life he had always known. However, there were times, late at night, when he would sit by the window and gaze out at the sea, wondering what his life would have been like if he had taken a different path. He had at times considered leaving and seeking new opportunities, perhaps in the city. His parents, especially his mother, had even encouraged him to go out and explore the world, wanting him to have a different life than the one they had lived. But something held him to Rivertown, an almost unbreakable bond that John could never fully explain. The sea was in his blood, just as it had been in his parents'. Now, with both his parents dead and the family home silent, John's days were marked by a simple routine. He would wake before sunrise, walk to the dock, and prepare his boat for another day on the ocean. The boat, though small, was reliable, just like his father's. John took special pride in taking care of it, making sure everything was in perfect order, from the nets to the lines, nothing escaped his watchful eye. When he set out to sea, he maintained a ritual of checking every detail, making sure nothing could go wrong. The other fishermen of Rivertown tried on several occasions to approach John, inviting him for a drink at the end of the day or to share a meal at the local tavern. However, he always politely declined. It wasn't that he was hostile, but there was a distance between him and the rest of the community that everyone seemed to understand, respecting his desire for solitude. Although the fishermen sometimes looked at him with a mixture of pity and understanding, they never insisted too much. The sea had a peculiar way of healing and hurting at the same time. Some days, John felt at peace, sitting in his boat, watching the waves and listening to the cries of the seagulls, as if the ocean could wash away the weight he carried in his chest. But other days, the sea seemed to hold all his pain, and the distant horizon only mocked him, offering an unattainable promise of something beyond. It was on one of these lonely nights, as the sun set behind the harbor, painting the sky with shades of orange and purple, that John met Emily. She stood on the edge of the dock, staring out at the water with an intensity that immediately caught his attention. There was something different about her, something that drew him in a way he couldn't fully understand. "Beautiful sunset," she said softly, never taking her eyes off the horizon. John nodded, unsure how to respond at first. He wasn't used to people striking up conversations with him anymore, but something in Emily's voice, a kind of warmth and sincerity, made him want to stay there, at least for a few more moments. "Yeah, it's peaceful," he said, though he felt like the word didn't do justice to what he was really feeling. In fact, it had been a long time since anything had truly felt peaceful. When Emily turned to face him, John was surprised by the light in her eyes. There was a lightness in them that contrasted sharply with the weight he had been carrying for so long. "My name is Emily," she said, extending her hand to him. "John," he replied, shaking her hand, surprised at how naturally it felt, as if they had known each other for ages. In the weeks that followed, they began to run into each other frequently on the docks, or during walks along the shore. Their conversations were always casual at first, but soon they began to share more than just superficial words. Emily wasn't like the other people in Rivertown. She didn't just talk about the weather or fishing. She wanted to know more about him, about his life, his family, what it was like to live so close to the sea. Slowly, John began to open up, telling her about his parents, the long lonely nights and the weight he carried in his chest. Emily listened with genuine attention, and in return, she shared her own travel stories, her journeys around the world before arriving in this small village, and how she had always been drawn to the ocean, even if she didn't know exactly why. There was a silent understanding between them. They were both searching for something they couldn't name, something they seemed to share in their essence. Their conversations flowed naturally, without rushing, without big statements or grand gestures. They walked together on the beach, with the sound of the waves gently crashing in the background, creating a harmony with their long conversations. In Emily, John found a kind of warmth that he didn't even know he needed. She didn't try to fix him, nor did she offer him empty comfort. She was simply there, and that was enough. Months passed, and one day, during a quiet afternoon at the port, Emily told him she was pregnant. The words hit him with a force he hadn't expected. He was silent for a few moments, as his mind tried to process the news, not with fear, but with an overwhelming sense of something new, something he thought was lost forever. Emily looked at him with a slight smile, waiting for his reaction. "We're having a baby," John finally said, almost to himself, as reality began to set in. Emily's smile widened. "Yes, we are," she replied. From that moment on, John's house, which had previously seemed empty and desolate, began to fill with life again. Together, they repainted the rooms, set up the crib, and transformed the atmosphere of the home with laughter and light, something he hadn't felt in a long time. The arrival of Jack, their son, was quiet but deeply meaningful. At the tiny cries of the newborn, John felt a surge of hope reborn within him, something he had buried many years ago. He looked at Emily, who was holding the baby in her arms, and realized that for the first time in years, he was not just surviving. He was, in fact, living again. That morning, as the wind blew hard, making the windows of the house shake and dark clouds gather on the horizon, John looked out the window. But this time, he did not feel the loneliness he had felt before. There was a new life by his side, a new reason to carry on. The sea was rough, its surface churned by the approaching storm. It had been years since a storm like this had hit the coast, and along with it, a deep feeling of unease took hold of John's chest. His interior seemed to mirror the chaos of the ocean, an equally fierce storm raged within him. The memories he had buried began to emerge, as the first drops of rain beat against the window, bringing to the surface memories he preferred to keep dormant. The air felt thick and suffocating, and he could almost hear, as if it were yesterday, the sound of the wind increasing in intensity on that fateful night, until it became deafening, as if the world itself were collapsing. John clenched his fists, his breathing becoming short and shallow. He didn't want to remember, but the storm outside forced him to relive the worst day of his life. On that same kind of night, with dark clouds tearing across the sky and howling winds piercing the cracks of the house, Emily and Jack had been taken from him forever. He tried to shake the memory, but it was impossible. That night, everything had seemed normal at first. The three of them were inside the house, protected from the storm, while John tried to reassure Emily, who was holding Jack against her chest, trying to calm the restless baby. He remembered telling her that it was just another storm that would soon pass, but something deep inside him told him that this was no ordinary night. The storm intensified, and then, like a dark omen, the light went out. The world outside became an indistinguishable chaos of wind and rain. John ran to the windows, checking the locks, fighting the growing panic that was taking over his chest. Emily watched him, her calm shaken by the intensity of the storm. "Do you think we should go somewhere safer?" she asked, her voice firm but slightly tinged with concern. She held Jack tightly, trying to protect him as best she could. John replied that they would be fine, but even he didn't believe his own words. The night seemed endless, the wind roaring through the cracks in the house, and the rain falling with a violence John had never witnessed before. He tried to remain calm, but fear consumed him. He decided to go to the boat to protect it from the devastating force of the storm. However, in the midst of the chaos, something went terribly wrong. The sound of breaking wood echoed through the house, followed by a scream muffled by the deafening roar of the wind. When John ran back inside, it was too late. The door had been ripped off by the gusts, and the last image he had was of Emily holding Jack, both of them being swallowed up by the merciless force of the storm. The days that followed were a blur. John joined the search teams, running tirelessly along the beach until his legs gave out, shouting their names into the wind, even though he knew they could not hear him. The sea, which had once brought him peace and solace, now seemed like a cruel expanse, hiding the two people he loved most. Emily and Jack were never found, swallowed up by the storm that took them away. Now, as John stared out the window, the sea seemed to have come to life again, as if mocking him, taunting him with memories he tried to stifle. The house groaned under the weight of the furious wind, and the cold that penetrated the walls was nothing compared to the pain that grew in his chest. Dark clouds filled the sky, and the waves crashed violently against the shore, replicating the scene of that tragic night. John took a step back from the window, his hands shaking. He sat at the kitchen table, his eyes unfocused as the rain hammered hard on the roof. Even after so long, he could still see Emily's face, the look in her eyes just before the door was ripped off by the wind, a silent plea in her eyes. Jack's cries still echoed in his mind, muffled by the fury of the storm. Outside, the wind and rain continued to intensify, but it was nothing compared to what was unfolding inside him. The inner storm he had tried to bury had finally consumed him completely. It was a secluded corner of the coast, where the waves gently lapped the rocks and the wind slid through the trees like a distant whisper. John often took refuge here, away from the suffocating familiarity of Rivertown, where every street, every corner, seemed trapped in memories of a past he was desperately trying to forget. Here, the world seemed distant, almost unreachable, and that comforted him. His life had become a repetitive, mechanical cycle. Every day he loaded his boat with the bare minimum needed to pass the hours on the water, no more, no less. Leaving the harbor, he steered the Salty Dog toward Cedar Bay, where the only sounds that filled the air were the cries of the seagulls and the steady ebb and flow of the tide. He rarely caught fish these days, but fishing wasn't what brought him here. He sought silence, emptiness, something the bay provided. Today was no different. Mind numb, John tied the boat to a tree near the shore, his movements automatic, emotionless. The sand beneath his boots was soft, and the salty breeze tugged at his worn jacket, but he no longer felt anything, not the cold, not the heat, not even the wind. The vast horizon of the bay offered him no space to deal with the emotions he insisted on burying, but they kept coming back. He found his usual spot under the palm trees, where the branches cast long shadows over the sand. He sat on the ground, leaning against the trunk of a tree, and closed his eyes. The sound of the waves gently breaking against the shore was a steady, comforting rhythm. John clung to its rhythm, hoping in vain for a moment of peace, a temporary relief from his pain. But the tranquility was abruptly interrupted by an unexpected sound, a distant, barely audible scream. His eyes flew open, and his heart raced. He sat up straight, listening intently, but the scream disappeared as quickly as it had come. For a moment, he thought he might have imagined it. After all, this bay had always been deserted. Who could possibly be there? But the scream came again, louder, clearer this time. John's heart raced. He stood up, his eyes scanning the shoreline for something, but everything seemed as it always had, empty. The sound rang out a third time, unmistakable now, a baby's cry. John felt his chest tighten, and the wall of emotions he had built up over the years began to crumble. The memories he had fought so hard to suppress came rushing back with overwhelming force. Jack. His son. He would have been so small. His screams would have been like that. John's hands shook as he clung to the tree trunk, trying to keep his composure. The sound was coming from a little way off, near a clump of palm trees. Against his better judgment, John began to walk slowly toward the sound, each cautious step, each cry a tug that drew him ever closer to something he feared to face. When he finally reached the palm trees, he stopped, his eyes fixed on the small figure curled up in the sand. There, nestled in a thin blanket, was a baby, no more than a few months old. The child's face was flushed, its soft cries of hunger or fear breaking the stillness of the bay. John stood still, his heart racing and his mind spinning. He didn't want this, didn't want to feel anything. But at the sight of the helpless child, something inside him stirred. Memories of Jack came back with painful clarity, the weight of holding his son in his arms, the feel of tiny fingers gripping his hand. Without realizing it, John slowly knelt down, his hands still shaking as he approached the baby. When he finally picked him up, the child's cries subsided, and the warmth of that small body pressed against John's chest sent a shiver through his body. He had forgotten what that felt like, the weight, the responsibility, the warmth of a fragile life entrusted to him. For a moment, John allowed himself to feel everything he had suppressed for so long, staring at that small being as if time had turned back. John hesitated for a moment. He could simply leave the baby there, move on, go back to his boat and pretend none of this had happened. The thought of abandoning the child there alone, however, disturbed him deeply, in a way he could not ignore. Taking a deep breath, he held the baby tighter, as if in that instant the decision had already been made. The surroundings seemed different now, the bay, once a haven of solitude, was filled with the soft moans of the baby in his arms, a sound that somehow broke the silence that had once comforted him. As he walked back to the boat, the small moans grew softer, until they faded into calm, regular breaths, as the baby fell asleep. John looked down at the child in his arms, feeling the weight of old wounds mixed with new uncertainties. He did not know what he was doing and had doubts about his ability to cope with the situation, but when he reached the water's edge, the warmth of the baby against his chest made it clear that there was no turning back. Cedar Bay, which had always been a place of escape and solitude for him, now took on a new meaning. Once a refuge to get away from memories, that remote corner now became the beginning of something new and unexpected. The oppressive silence of his home had also changed. What had once seemed like an empty, lifeless space was now filled with the small, rhythmic sounds of the baby sleeping in a makeshift crib. John sat by the window, looking out at the soft light of dawn over Rivertown, but he remained inside the house, his steps slow, reflecting on everything that had happened since the day he brought the baby from the bay. He had no intention of keeping the child, he remembered that every day. When he found the baby, his idea was to take him to the authorities, let them decide what to do. However, from the moment he crossed the door of his house with the little bundle in his arms, something changed. Days passed and, instead of taking the baby away, John remained there, caring for him. The baby was nestled beneath old blankets he had dug out of a forgotten closet. John found himself tidying the house in a way he hadn't done in years, wiping dust from neglected corners, rearranging furniture to make room for the crib. It was small, but it was more than he had done since before the baby came along. The boy, John had noticed, was quiet. When he wasn't sleeping, he would lie there, staring at the ceiling with curious eyes and small fists that clenched and unclenched as if exploring the world around him. At night, when the village around him fell silent, John would sit in the chair by the window, listening to the baby's soft, steady breathing, and feel something inside him that he hadn't felt in a long time. The shield he had built around his heart was beginning to crumble, and it was Jack, his lost son, who he saw when he looked at the baby. The memories came flooding back, the same curious eyes, the same way he moved his hands in his restless sleep. John's throat tightened every time he looked at the baby, as if all the memories he had tried to bury were coming back to him at once. The boy still didn't have a name, and for some reason it took John a while to realize what should have been obvious from the start. Sitting heavily in the chair, elbows resting on his knees, he looked down at the small figure in the crib and finally knew what he had to do. The baby needed a name. And as much as it hurt, there was only one name that made sense. Jake, he whispered, the word strange on his lips after so many years. It was bittersweet to name the boy after the son he had lost, but it felt right, in a way that comforted him and hurt him at the same time. Jake was no replacement, John knew that. But there was something about this baby's presence that made him feel a little less alone, even if he wasn't ready to admit it yet. The baby stirred slightly in the crib, and John stood up, moving toward him with careful movements, his mind finally beginning to accept what his heart already knew. He could not ignore this new life that was now part of his. John adjusted the blanket carefully, smoothing it over the child's small, fragile body before stepping away. The name, Jake, hung in the air, filling the room with a new feeling, a different kind of silence than usual. It was no longer the suffocating silence of sadness that he knew so well, but something softer, almost light. The days in Rivertown stretched long and quiet, with the seasons flowing into one another, while time seemed to ease, little by little, the pains that John carried. Although the memories of the past remained, he began to notice subtle changes in himself. These changes began small, almost imperceptible. A smile that appeared on his lips as he watched Jake play in the front yard, or the way his hands no longer trembled as he held the boy against his chest. Jake was growing up fast, and with him, John's routine also changed, almost without him noticing. Mornings were spent together, fishing in the tranquility of Cedar Bay. John stood at the bow of the boat, casting his nets with the skill of years of practice, while Jake watched with serious concentration, as if he were trying to learn every move. "Is it heavy?" Jake asked one day, his voice full of childish curiosity as he watched John pull the net from the water. John looked at him, the sun shining in the boy's bright eyes, and then handed him the end of the net. "See for yourself." Jake gripped it with both hands, straining, and let out a soft laugh as he nearly toppled over under the weight. John didn't laugh, but a soft smile broke the mask he wore so often. It was a small sign that life was slowly getting back on track. After fishing, they would carry their catch back to the dock. Although the residents of Rivertown still gave John a wide berth, something had changed. Now, when he walked by with Jake by his side, some would wave, others would murmur a greeting. Mary, from the corner store, always had a word for Jake. "You're growing up fast, aren't you, darling?" she would say with a smile, though her eyes would often dart to John, assessing him carefully. As Jake grew older, he became more curious, asking questions that were initially simple and easy to answer. "Why don't we ever go to the store, Dad?" Or, "Did you catch more fish when you were little?" John would easily brush them aside, focusing on the tasks of his day. But over time, the questions began to deepen, becoming harder to ignore. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sky change colors at dusk, Jake asked, "Dad, where was I born?" The question fell into the silence between them, fragile and unexpected. John's grip on the mug tightened, the warmth of the tea suddenly seeming distant. He could feel Jake's eyes on him, waiting, searching for an answer he wasn't yet ready to give. "You were born here," John lied, his voice firm, though the bitter taste of the lie was impossible to ignore. Jake frowned suspiciously, but didn't press the issue. John stood up abruptly. "Time for bed," he said, ending the conversation. Jake was hurt, that much was clear, but he didn't press the issue. He was a good kid, too good for the weight of the truth that John couldn't yet bear. As the days passed, John found himself watching Jake more often. The boy's vibrant energy filled every corner of the house, and there were moments when John saw glimpses of Jack in the boy, in the way he tilted his head in thought, or the way his hands moved restlessly when he was excited. These moments were bittersweet, bringing a mixture of pain and a strange sense of healing. Their walks on the beach became part of their daily routine. Jake would run ahead, chasing the tide as it came in and out, his laughter mingling with the soft sound of the waves. John followed a few steps behind, watching from a distance, his heart feeling lighter than it had in years. He hadn't realized how much he missed that simple joy, the joy that Jake's presence brought, somehow breaking down the barriers of pain and loneliness that John had erected around himself for so long. John didn't know exactly when it happened, but at some point he realized that the weight he had been carrying for so long had lifted. His solitary and contained life began to open up. He, who had previously avoided interactions, now found himself talking to people during his trips to town, exchanging small words and even smiles with those he had previously ignored. Jake's presence seemed to soften the edges of everything around him, including his own heart. But even with this change, John knew that the questions would return. He knew that the past and its secrets still haunted him, and eventually he would have to face the truth. The hardest part would be deciding if he was ready to share this secret with Jake, the boy who now meant so much to him. It was a morning like any other in Rivertown, the sky a clear blue, with the first signs of autumn in the air. John and Jake had just returned from the dock, with a modest catch, but enough for the day's meals. Jake, with his infectious energy, ran around the house, excited, talking about the huge fish they had almost caught. John, with a calm smile, watched from the kitchen window. This simple routine, this stable life, was something new to him. For the first time in years, he felt a certain peace. But this moment of tranquility was abruptly interrupted. The sound of cars approaching on the dirt road brought a sense of alert. John's heart raced, and he stopped drying his hands, clutching the cloth tightly as he looked outside. 2 police cars, their lights off but imposing, pulled up. Their presence was menacing, and John's stomach knotted. Jake, sensing the tension in the air, stopped running. "Dad," his voice was small, uncertain. John didn't answer right away, his mind racing, trying to understand what could be happening. Nothing made sense. A firm knock on the door pulled John from his thoughts. When he opened it, his heart pounding in his chest, 2 police officers stood before him, their expression serious. Behind them, a man in a suit stepped forward. His face was cold and stern, and John recognized him by a name he had only heard in passing, Robert Mayfield. Mayfield's eyes flicked to Jake before settling on John with an intensity that sent a shiver down his spine. "John Wilson," one of the officers said, his voice tight. The other officer exchanged a quick glance with his partner before continuing. "You are under arrest for the kidnapping of Robert Mayfield's son." The words hit John like a blow. Kidnapping? He couldn't process them right away. "This is a mistake," he tried to argue, disbelief written all over his face. "I didn't take him. I found him. He was abandoned." But the officers didn't hesitate. With efficient movements, they handcuffed him, and the metallic sound of the handcuffs closing on his wrists sounded like the snap of a fate he could not avoid. Jake, not understanding what was happening, watched everything with wide eyes, his small voice cutting through the chaos. "Dad? What's going on?" John turned his head toward the boy, his heart clenching. "It's going to be okay, Jake. Stay inside," he said, trying to remain calm, but the anguish was palpable. Jake's hands gripped the doorframe, as if holding on could keep his world from falling apart. "Dad, where are they taking you?" Jake asked, his voice shaking, and tears began to stream down his cheeks. John swallowed hard, fighting the panic. "I'll be back, I promise," he said, trying to reassure the boy, but the words sounded weak, even to him. The officers led him to the car, the sound of their boots crunching on the gravel the only sound in the heavy air. John tried to look back, to give Jake some more comfort, but the boy was already disappearing from view as he was shoved into the police car. Robert Mayfield watched impassively, showing no emotion at the emotional toll he was taking. To him, this was simply a matter of reclaiming what he considered rightfully his. The car door slammed shut, and from the back seat, John could see Jake standing in the doorway of the house, small and frail, tears streaming down his face. The weight of it all came down on John like a crushing wave, the charges, the handcuffs, Jake's gaze, all of it blending into a suffocating sense of helplessness. The car's engine roared, and as they drove away from the house, the familiar streets of Rivertown became a blur. John's mind spun, trying to understand how all of this had happened. How could anyone believe he had kidnapped Jake? How could the love and care he felt for that boy be turned into something so cruel and misunderstood? With his hands handcuffed and his heart in pieces, he could only think of one thing: Jake. He clenched his fists, feeling panic give way to rising anger. He wasn't a kidnapper, quite the opposite. He had saved Jake, given him a home when no one else cared. The silence of the city as the police car drove forward was almost deafening. People who had once waved amiably now looked away, keeping their distance. The weight of the accusations hung in the air like a shadow, more real and oppressive than any justification he could give. John closed his eyes, and the image of Jake's crying face burned into his mind, etched with pain and despair. The drive to the police station seemed endless, each second a torture. John stared out the windows of the police car, watching the fields and winding roads pass by in a blur. His mind was a whirlwind of disbelief and fear, the soft hum of the engine interrupted only by the sporadic sound of the police radio. The officers ahead didn't say a word, and he didn't even try to ask them, because what could he say? The weight of the handcuffs tightening around his wrists was a constant reminder of how his life had been shattered in the blink of an eye. When they finally arrived at the police station, the tall buildings of the city loomed over him oppressively. It had been years since John had visited the city, and it now felt cold and distant. As he was escorted inside, he kept his head down, his mind focused on one thing: Jake. The fear of what might be happening to the boy tightened his chest, making it difficult to breathe. He knew he had to remain calm and clear-headed, not for his own sake, but for Jake's. In the cold, dimly lit waiting room, John was left sitting in a metal chair, still handcuffed. The clock on the wall ticked cruelly, each second longer than the last. He stared at the floor, trying to find a way out of this situation. How could they charge him with kidnapping? He had saved Jake, not taken him by force. But the hours passed and no relief or answers came. Occasionally, an officer or two would pass by and glance in his direction, but no one spoke to him. Anxiety was eating away at John, and he barely noticed the pain in his back from sitting in the same position for so long. All he could think about was Jake, and the fear of losing the boy for good was gnawing at him, relentless and sharp. He knew he couldn't lose him, not after everything they had been through. Then the door creaked, and a man in a suit walked into the room with an unreadable expression. Right behind him was Robert Mayfield, his face stern and his gaze cold, just like in John's house. John's heart was pounding. This was the man who had destroyed his life, who was accusing him of something he would never do. John clenched his fists, fighting the urge to scream and demand that this mess be resolved. The man in the suit, probably a detective, sat across from John and opened a file. "We've reviewed the allegations," he said, his voice too calm for the storm of emotions inside John. "It seems things are not as simple as they first seemed." John's heart raced and he straightened, his eyes quickly darting to Robert, who stood near the door, arms crossed, watching the scene intently. "We've learned some new information about Jake's disappearance," the detective continued, choosing his words carefully. "It appears his abduction was not random." John frowned, feeling the tension in the room shift as the detective turned to Robert. "Mr. Mayfield," he said, "it appears your son was taken as part of a vendetta. Some of your old enemies wanted to get to you, and Jake was their way of doing it." The silence that followed was thick and heavy. Robert's face paled, his impassive facade beginning to crack for the first time. "Revenge," he repeated, more to himself than to anyone else in the room. John's heart raced even faster, his mind trying to process what that meant. The detective leaned back in his chair and closed the file in front of him. "You're not a criminal, Mr. Wilson," he said. "We haven't found any evidence to suggest that you had anything to do with the kidnapping. It appears that you found Jake and took care of him when no one else would." Immediate relief washed over John, but it was quickly overshadowed by the realization of what this meant. Jake was Robert Mayfield's son. John clenched his fists as his initial panic turned into quiet rage. He wasn't a kidnapper, he would never do something like that. On the contrary, he had saved Jake, the boy he had given a home to when no one else seemed to care. Yet the city remained silent as the police car drove through the streets. The people who had once waved at him now looked away, keeping their distance, as if they had already judged his guilt without hearing his words. John closed his eyes, trying to push Jake's tearful face away, but the image refused to fade, etching itself into his mind. The drive to the police station seemed endless. As the police car drove along the winding roads, the fields passed in a blur, but John's mind was caught in a knot of disbelief and dread. The hum of the engine was the only constant sound, interrupted occasionally by the crackling of the police radio. The officers in front didn't say a single word to him, and John didn't ask them anything either. What could he say? The weight of the handcuffs on his wrists was a constant reminder of how his life had suddenly fallen apart. When they reached the city, the tall buildings felt strange and cold, far removed from the familiarity he had felt in his village. He hadn't set foot there in years. With his head down, he was escorted into the police station, his thoughts fixed on one thing, Jake. What was happening to him? The waiting room was cold and dimly lit, the kind of place that made time pass too slowly. John sat in a metal chair, his hands still handcuffed, while the clock on the wall seemed to echo each passing second. Nerves tightened his stomach, and he barely noticed the pain in his back from sitting for so long. All he could think about was Jake and the terrifying fear of being separated from him forever. The thought ate at him from the inside out, making the air around him heavy and suffocating. After what felt like hours, the door finally creaked, and a man entered. He was wearing a suit and his expression was unreadable. Behind him, Robert Mayfield entered the room, his face cold and stern, just as it had been in John's house. John's heart pounded in his chest. This was the man who had destroyed his world with false accusations. John fought the urge to scream, to tell him it was all a mistake, but the words stuck in his throat. The man in the suit, probably a detective, sat across from him, opening a file as he spoke in a tone too calm for the whirlwind of emotions John was feeling. "We've looked into the allegations," the detective said, choosing his words carefully. "It seems things aren't as simple as we first thought." John's heart beat faster, and he straightened up, looking at Robert, who stood with his arms crossed and an unreadable expression. The detective continued. "We've discovered new information about Jake's disappearance. It appears his abduction was not a random act." The silence that followed was almost unbearable. Jake was taken as part of a vendetta, a retaliation for old business. John was stunned. His gaze flickered from Robert to the detective, trying to process what this meant. Robert, for his part, was pale, his rigid demeanor breaking for the first time. Revenge? Robert muttered, more to himself than to the others. The detective closed the file and leaned back in his chair. You are not a criminal, Mr. Wilson. We found no evidence that you were involved in the kidnapping. On the contrary, it appears that you found Jake and took him in when no one else was there. Relief washed over John for a brief moment, but it was quickly replaced by another crushing truth: Jake was Robert's son. No matter how much John loved him, no matter how much he had cared for the boy as if he were his own. Legally, Jake belonged to Robert, and now nothing could change that. Robert cleared his throat, breaking the silence. I owe you my gratitude, Mr. Wilson, he said, his tone softer. You saved my son when I couldn't. John couldn't answer. His throat was too tight, his emotions raw. All he could think about was tomorrow, when Robert would come back to take Jake away. When they finally released him, the word "free" sounded hollow. He walked out of the police station, his shoulders heavy with the weight of what was to come. The silence of the night when he got home was almost deafening. Jake slept in the next room, oblivious to what fate had in store for him. John stood by the window, staring out at the dark sea. The storm inside him continued to rage. Tomorrow, Robert would come for Jake, and John knew he couldn't stop it. The house, once full of life, would soon be empty, and the sound of Jake's laughter. It would just be a painful memory. John couldn't shake the bitterness he felt as he thought about the town Robert Mayfield had described to him. The man had talked about prestigious schools, well-kept parks, and all the opportunities Jake would have living in the town. But to John, it all sounded hollow. He could tell from the look in Jake's eyes that the boy didn't care about those things. No matter how many activities and luxuries the town had to offer, what Jake truly loved was the ocean, the simple life they had built together in Rivertown. When Robert arrived, Jake tried to keep his composure, to put on a brave face, but John could see the way the boy's shoulders slumped as they talked about the town. Jake tried to hide his feelings, but in a moment when Robert was distracted, he said quietly, I miss fishing. His eyes were distant, lost in thought, and John's heart sank. I don't want to go, Jake finished, with a sadness that seemed heavy in the air. John put his hand on the boy's shoulder, unsure of what to say. What could he say, after all? There were no words that could change fate. He had no legal claim on Jake, no way to keep him there, no matter how much he wanted to. You'll come back, he whispered, but the words sounded hollow, without conviction. They both knew that even if Jake did come back, things would never be the same. Now, as the night wore on, John felt the weight of tomorrow approaching fast. Tomorrow, Jake would be whisked away to a life of luxury in the city, something John could never compete with. But he wondered, with a knot in his chest, if Jake would truly be happy there. The city, with its imposing buildings and crowded streets, seemed to belong to another world, a world completely removed from the calm, predictable rhythms of the sea that Jake loved so much. Rivertown was Jake's home. He loved the morning spent on the fishing boat, the smell of salt in the air, the adrenaline of pulling in a full net. The sea was a part of Jake, just as it was a part of John. And now, all of that would be ripped away from him. John slowly stood up and walked to Jake's bedroom door. He stood there, leaning against the frame, watching the boy sleep under the old quilt that Emily, his late wife, had sewn years ago. Jake looked so peaceful as he slept, his small body wrapped in the blanket. John thought about how small Jake had been when he first found him, and how much he had grown in those few years. Tomorrow, this house would be empty again, just as it had been before Jake came into his life. The night was as silent as the day Jake left. John sat at the kitchen table, staring at the worn wood beneath his calloused hands. The distant hum of the ocean drifted in through the open window, but the house felt emptier than ever. For the past few weeks, he could still hear the sound of Jake's laughter echoing from the corners of every room. He could still feel the boy's presence lingering in the air. But now, Rivertown was too quiet. Quiet in a way that made him uncomfortable. The news that the charges against John had been dropped brought no relief. Yes, he had been acquitted of the kidnapping charge, but that hardly mattered. What mattered was that Robert Mayfield had taken Jake back to town, where, according to the law, the boy belonged. John let out a heavy sigh, his eyes wandering to the fishing nets piled by the door. He hadn't touched them since Jake had been gone. The sea, which had once been his refuge, now felt empty. Something was missing, as if without Jake by his side, there was no reason to go out to sea anymore. He knew Jake wasn't entirely happy in town. Robert's letters had arrived frequently in the early days, detailing how Jake was adjusting to his new life, to the expensive schools, the lavish activities, and the opportunities John could never provide. But behind the carefully chosen words, John could sense something missing. Jake didn't belong there. He belonged to the sea, to the simple rhythm of Rivertown, and to the life he and John had built together. From Jake's first letter, John had sensed something was wrong, though the tone of the message didn't immediately make it obvious. Jake's handwriting was careful, but there was a certain unnaturalness to it, as if he were trying to appear more comfortable than he actually was. When John read the words, "I miss the ocean," he realized there was something deeper behind that brief comment. The city is noisy, and everything moves too fast. "I can't hear the waves like I do back home," Jake had written. And that word, home, kept echoing in John's mind. He hadn't known Jake saw Rivertown that way, but the boy now associated the quiet sound of the waves with what he considered home. As John pondered this, the sound of tires crunching on gravel outside pulled him out of his thoughts. He stood up quickly and headed for the door. Dusk cast long shadows across the yard, and in the driveway, a black car was parked. John felt his heart sink as the passenger door opened. And there stood Jake, smaller than he remembered, a bag slung over his shoulder. For a moment, neither of them moved. The wind carried the salty smell of the sea, and it felt like time had slowed down. Then, with a sudden burst of energy, Jake ran toward the house. John barely had time to react before the boy wrapped him in a tight hug, his face pressed against John's chest. "I'm home," Jake whispered, his voice muffled but thick with emotion. John closed his eyes and rested a hand on the boy's head. He didn't need to say anything. The silence that followed between them said more than any words could. They stayed like that for a while, with the soft sound of the waves in the background and the last rays of sunlight disappearing over the horizon. After a few minutes, John pulled away slightly, holding Jake's shoulders and looking into the boy's eyes. There was a mixture of relief and something deeper on his face, something John recognized, a quiet understanding of what it meant to belong somewhere, to someone. "Let's go inside," John said, his voice thick with emotion. Jake nodded, wiping his eyes with his sleeve, and followed John into the house. The familiar scent of wood and sea air filled the air as they entered, and Jake walked over to the table as if by default, the same way he always did. He dropped his bag on the floor with a soft thud, and John could feel the house shift. Somehow, Jake's presence seemed to restore the life that had been drained from the place over the past few weeks. The boy sat down at the table, resting his small hands on the tabletop, as if no time had passed since the day he had left. John walked into the kitchen and picked up the plate of food he had prepared earlier, even though he didn't have much of an appetite at the time. He set the plate in front of Jake, who looked at him with a genuine, grateful smile before starting to eat. Leaning against the counter, John watched in silence, watching the boy eat peacefully. Everything seemed to suddenly fall back into place. The house, which had previously seemed empty and lifeless, was now full again, with a new energy that only Jake's presence could bring. Warmth spread through John's chest when, after a while, Jake finally looked up from his plate. "My dad said I could stay here, you know." Jake spoke softly, almost hesitantly. "He knows how much I miss it here, and you too," he added, his voice thick with emotion. John felt a lump tighten in his throat, but he forced it down, keeping his tone steady. "Is this what you want?" he asked, even though his heart was pounding. Jake nodded, his eyes serious. "Yes. This is where I belong." They didn't say much more after that, but there was no need. The air around them was thick with a silent understanding, a bond that had always been there but now felt even stronger and more certain. John knew deep down that Jake would always have a connection to the city and to his biological father, but here, beside the sea, was where the boy's heart truly was. As the sun disappeared completely, leaving the house in a soft, twilight glow, John stepped out onto the porch, Jake close behind. There, side by side, they watched the waves gently crash against the shore. The storm had passed, the sea was calm again, and so was John. For the first time in years, he felt a deep peace, a sense that everything was finally right. "What a journey we've been on together," he reflected internally, from the initial pain of his loss to the growing strength of his relationship with Jake. This story reminds us that home is about more than just a physical place, it's about the people we choose to keep close to us, even if life sometimes takes us away. The ocean, with all its unpredictability, means a lot to John and Jake. It's the place their hearts always return to. If this story touched you the way it did me, be sure to give this video a try. Like and share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you're new here, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell so you don't miss out on more powerful stories like this. Thanks for joining me today. I'll see you in the next video, where we'll continue exploring tales that inspire, challenge, and move us. Stay tuned, and remember, home is where the heart finds its true peace. Until next time.